Great. Well then, thank you very much for everyone who is joining us here today. So my name is Selina Scherbeck. I'm a member of the digital innovation team of the student board who organizes these webinars. And today we would like to welcome you to the 13th episode of our CEMS Webinar Series. And here with us today, we have Dr. Christian Busch and Dr. Konstantin Locke, who will be talking to us about the serendipity mindset. And we're all very much looking forward to that. So thank you very much for the both of you to join us today. Before we begin the webinar and your introductions, maybe just a final note from my side to all of our participants. So this is a webinar format. All of our participants are automatically muted and have their cameras turned off. But we kindly ask you to raise any questions that you might have in the Q&A functionality available here. You can find this in the bottom black bar on your screen, and the Q&A functionality differs from the chat function because it allows you to upvote the questions of other participants. So feel free to use the Q&A functionality throughout the webinar as well. And now I would like to directly give the floor to you, Dr. Locke and Dr. Busch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Selina. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar about the serendipity mindset. So I am Professor Konstantin Locke. I teach at the London School of Economics, and I joined the LSE in 2008. I teach organizational behavior and leadership, and in fact, I am just now this year becoming kind of part of the CEMS network. Like LSE is already part of the CEMS network, but this year I'm taking on the global leadership core course. I don't know, maybe I'll get to meet some of you. I don't know if you are current students. But so I have known Christian for a long time. When I joined in 2008, Christian was a master's student at the LSE, and then in 2009, he became a PhD student. He worked with his supervisor, Professor Harry Barkema, to set up the Innovation and Co-Creation Lab, which I was part of. We also, after he graduated from his PhD, we taught together on some courses. There was a summer school negotiation course, and then there's an executive master's that I'm program director for. So we've worked together quite a lot, and now we are very proud of Christian, one of our PhD students, becoming a faculty member at New York University and writing a book. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce him and to chair this webinar today. One thing I wanted to note is that this book is all about serendipity. It's about luck, but it's about creating your own luck. And I recently wrote a book, and I know how difficult it is to get great endorsements for a book. And on the back of Christian's book, he's got endorsements from Daniel Pink, Arianna Huffington, Reid Hoffman. I mean, these are really famous people. And I was like, Christian, how did you do this? Like, these are really famous people. How did you get them to endorse your book? And he was like, well, I went to a lot of events. I sent cold emails and warm emails, and it was just a lot of work. It was a lot of networking, which was not the answer I expected. I thought he was going to say, oh yeah, I happen to know somebody who knows somebody who knows that. But no, he actually put in the work, which is exactly what he's talking about in the book, is if you want luck to happen, you have to put in the work. It's that intersection between human action and luck. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you that he practices what he preaches. Now, before I hand over to Christian, there is a little poll that we wanted you to take. If you could just answer this poll, it says, do you consider yourself to be a lucky person? Yes or no? Okay, a few more people. Got about 90% of people have answered so far. Just a few more. Okay, I will end polling now and share the results. So 92% said yes, 8% said no. Okay, and with that, I will hand over to you, Christian.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction, Constant. And thank you so much, Selina, Jessica, and Melissa for pulling this together. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. It's wonderful to be here with you today, and to also be in a room together with Constant. I mean, Constant has been one of my absolute favorite collaborators / colleagues over the years. I recommend, you know, a lot of you will probably take courses with her. Those who don't, reconsider your course choices at the moment and do take some of her courses. I've personally learned a lot from Constant, everything around, you know, biases to how do you think about influence in the workplace and beyond, and everything else. So I think there's so much to be learned from Constant. So I'm delighted to be here today with her, and thanks so much, Constant, for being such a wonderful part of this journey of the book as well. So that's really much appreciated. So this is really a subject that I've been extremely fascinated by for the last kind of 15 years of my life. It's kind of started out, you know, when I was a kid in high school, I was extremely rebellious. I channeled my energy in a lot of ways that are very questionable. I had to repeat a year in high school, actually. I was quote unquote asked to leave school, so essentially expelled. So I had a kind of very you know, questionable past in that regard, which, by the way, makes me think a lot about education systems nowadays in terms of how do we get people to channel their energies in creative ways. But when I turned 18, I got my first car, and I transferred my lifestyle into my driving style. Similarly, kind of at that point, probably reckless. And you know, one day I wasn't that lucky anymore. I crashed into a couple of parked cars, and I will not forget the policeman who came to my car, and he looked inside and he was like, "Oh my God, he's still alive." And so it was that idea of like, you know, I was supposed to be dead, and that stuck with me. You know, I asked myself a lot of questions. If I would have died, would it have been worth it? Did I do anything meaningful? And all these questions, you know, in a way kind of kept me thinking. And I started reading a lot of books around meaning and purpose and so on. And one that stuck particularly with me was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is all about this idea of finding meaning even in the most dire of circumstances. And we just discussed actually about, so I had COVID in March, and I reread the book when I kind of had severe breathing problems and everything else, because it was really about this kind of, it's a beautiful anchor to when you are in periods where you feel a certain kind of hopelessness or so, that then it re-anchors and says, okay, there's still some meaning in those kind of periods, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment. And so that kind of accident like put me on this search for meaning. And I started out as a community builder first, because I like realized, you know, I love connecting people, connecting ideas and helping them make meaningful ideas happen. And then went more into entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, and then kind of, you know, the inner imposter was constantly nagging in the background. Christian, do we actually know what we do here? We always talk about impact, but what do we actually have for an impact? And so I went more into academia, trying to understand patterns behind things. And so that is a lot of my work now, trying to understand how do you essentially develop social impact? How do you develop purpose-driven organizations? And how do we as individuals thrive? And one of the things I found fascinating over the years was that when I looked at the most successful purpose-driven people, both in my kind of quote unquote personal life and in my research, they seem to have something in common. They intuitively cultivate serendipity. They see something in the unexpected. They see something in uncertainty and turn that into positive outcomes. And so that's really what the book is about. And that's what the talk today is about. The question of how do we build that muscle for the unexpected that allows us to turn the unexpected, to turn uncertainty into positive outcomes. Being the German I am, of course, a very structured table of content. The last kind of residuals of my Germanness showing here. So I'd love to start with the context, then diving into what do we talk about when we talk about serendipity? What are some of the examples, and what is a science-based framework for understanding it? And then really, what are some of the practices we can all use in our lives to go about it? Constant mentioned the book. That's really something that it has been such a kind of interesting journey in the sense that, you know, I learned more about myself when writing that book than I learned in the years before, because it really forces you to reflect on your own life in relation to the things that you studied. And it's based on that kind of long research, but also my own life. And so stories from people around the world, from former drug dealers in sub-Saharan Africa to the CEO of big companies, and really trying to understand what do individuals have in common that somehow have been shaping their lives towards more success and more meaning. But then where it got really exciting for me also as on my nerdy kind of academic researcher side, having that hat on, was really about also looking into different sciences, into molecular chemistry, into physics, quantum physics, into management science, and really trying to understand what are these different disciplines saying about serendipity, and what seems to be a pattern that they all seem to agree on. And that really kind of is the anchor of the book, to say we have this science-based framework that is based on the different sciences that say increasingly the same thing, just using different language. And then kind of like, what are some of the stories and what are exercises we can use to really increase our serendipity score. So our, like the kind of serendipity and the quality of serendipity and the amount of serendipity we have in our lives. Now, to make sure that we're all on the same page, just a couple of examples here of serendipity. First one is, if you have erratic hand movements as I do, you spill coffee quite often. And so, back in the days when coffee shops were still open inside, imagine the situation, you spill a coffee over the person next to you, and you sense there might be some kind of connection there. You don't know what it is, but you sense there might be something. And now you have two options, right? Option number one is that you just say, I'm so sorry, here's a napkin. And then you walk out at some point and you're like, I should have talked with this person. Like, what could have happened had I talked with this person? Option number two is, you start a conversation. You're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I was so immersed in reading this book, which is about X, Y, Z. You start a conversation, which might then, end in finding the love of your life, or a co-founder or a business partner or else. And so it's these kind of situations when you think back in your own lives. I'm sure you had situations, in the way you found your partner, or in the way of how you kind of found your course now, or maybe a new job, that it might have been such a kind of coincidental moment where you had to proactively do something about it. It was your choice to continue some kind of conversation and do something with it. Especially at the moment, there's a lot of examples of serendipity happening out of necessity. So, this is an example where breweries, COVID happened as an unexpected event, and a lot of breweries weren't able to sell their produce anymore to restaurants. So they kind of had this idea of, hey, why can't we use our alcohol to produce hand sanitizer? And so kind of this unexpected moment made them realize, oh, we can use that in a completely different way, and now became hand sanitizer companies. This here is one of my favorites. You might remember the volcano that broke out a couple of years ago with the unpronounceable name. An Icelandic friend of mine at some point said, Christian, you're stupid trying to pronounce it. Just say E and then 14 letters, whatever these 14 letters are. So this kind of Eyjafjallajökull volcano broke out. And you might remember that most flights were grounded in Central Europe, and in London especially, nobody got out of the country. Some took the boats, but most people were kind of stuck in London. And I got a call on a Saturday morning from an unknown number. I was sleepy. I was like, oh, what is this? But I picked up. I was curious. And so I picked up, and on the phone was a guy who said, well, hey, this is Nathaniel. We haven't met yet, but a mutual friend gave me your number. And you know what? I was at the Skoll World Forum, and all these amazing people at this kind of forum, which is the biggest forum for social entrepreneurs in the world, all these amazing people are stuck in London now. And so they have nothing to do, That was before Netflix and everything. So people were just kind of like hanging around and had nothing to do. So he was like, I want to organize a conference. So within 30-ish hours, he organized TEDx Volcano with amazing speakers like Jeff Skoll, with over 10,000 people on the recorded live stream, and one of the most successful TEDx events of all times. And what he did was he saw this unexpected moment, the volcano breaking out, but he knew that TED would love the idea of saying, there is some unexpected thing we turn into an opportunity. And he knew that local people would be very excited to get involved with a TED type event. So he turned the unexpected into positive outcomes. And if we have time later, we can talk about some of the underlying things there as well. Can anyone guess what this thing on the upper right is? Any ideas what that could be? You can, I don't know if we have a comment function, but if not, maybe in the Q&A function, we can, you can put this in there as well.
There's a chat. There's a chat they can type it into.
Fantastic, yeah. Perfect. So in the chat, if you have ideas, if
yeah.
you want to.
So someone said Viagra, someone said placebo.
Excellent. Okay, so a well-informed audience. Thank you. So indeed, this is Viagra. And so that was actually where a couple of decades ago, some researchers were and, you know, instead of saying, oh my God, this is embarrassing, or oh my God, what is this side effect about?
Wait, Christian, I don't know if it was just me, but your sound cut out for a little bit there. Could you just repeat the story?
Yeah, absolutely. This is where a couple of decades ago, some researchers essentially said, you know, they were trying to find a better way to cure angina, the disease. And they realized that there was some kind of movement happening in male participants' trousers. And instead of saying, oh my God, this is embarrassing, or let's find a better way to cure that side effect, they essentially said, you know what, a lot of men in the world have that problem. So why don't we develop a medication that actually goes into that direction? And that's how Viagra evolved. Now, can anyone guess what this is on the lower right? Any guesses on the lower right, what that could be? No?
Nothing.
In the chat, anyone wants
Nope.
to in the chat?
No guesses in the chat?
No guesses in the chat. And a washing machine, yeah, thank you, Anna.
Oh, there, someone said washing machine. Yeah, a couple people.
So yeah, we're coming close. So this is a kind of washing machine. It's actually a washing machine of the largest white goods producer in the world. And I had been doing a bit of work with them, and they produce all these washing machines, refrigerators and everything. And they had farmers call them up a couple of years ago who said, you know what, we're trying to wash our potatoes in the washing machine and it always breaks down. What a crappy machine. And so what would we usually tell them? We would probably say, well, don't wash your potatoes in the washing machine. It's not made for them, right? What they did was the opposite. They said, you know what, that is unexpected, but there's a lot of farmers in China. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? And so that's how the potato washing machine emerged as one of their products. Now, what all these examples have in common is that they all had some kind of trigger happen, right? Something that was unexpected. A volcano broke out, COVID happened, movement in male participants' trousers, pushing spilling a coffee, these kind of things. But then there had to be someone who connected the dots, who did something with it, who related it to some bigger problem or something that could be useful. So who made the accident meaningful. And we'll talk about this more later, that serendipity is both about making accidents more meaningful, but also about creating more meaningful accidents. And we'll talk more about this. But here it's really about making the accident meaningful by connecting dots to something bigger, and then having the tenacity to actually go through with it and to do something with it. Now, this is very different from the blind luck, right? Blind luck is all about being born into a good family or a loving family, things that happen to us passively. That's a lot of the kind of social inequality in the world that we're seeing, where we are passively being put into positions where some people are quote unquote luckier than others by birth, right? And so that's kind of systemic questions a lot of times that we also have to work on in parallel in terms of the question of how do we design policy and everything else that tackles these kind of societal inequalities. And at the same time, this is really, serendipity is all about smart active luck. It's the kind of luck that in every context we can somehow do something by the way we look at the world and by the way we connect the dots. Now, the problem, of course, is that most of the time we miss serendipity. We might not see the trigger, or we might not be able to connect the dots and do something with it, or we might not have the tenacity to actually go through with it. So at any stage of that process, we can miss it. But also the beauty is that every stage of the process, we can do something about. We can seed more trigger, and I'll talk about in a second how we can do that. We can train our mind to connect more dots, and we can train our resiliency and tenacity to actually follow through with these kind of things. Now, I want to start with what is holding us back from doing this more? What is holding us back from more serendipity? And one thing here, of course, is, and that's why I'm delighted that Constance is also here, is really a lot about biases, right? What are the subconscious biases that we all have that hold us back a lot of times, right? And we talked earlier about, like, there's a lot of biases or a lot of kind of things that might hold us back around imposter syndrome, around like not feeling worthy of an opportunity. There are a lot of things around where it is natural biases that we all have that apply across different areas. And I highly recommend, by the way, Constance has a great book coming up next year called Making Your Voice Heard, which will be a lot around questions of biases within organizations and how we can think about inclusivity better and really making your voice heard. So influencing things differently. So I think it will be a lot beautifully written about biases and so on. And for now, the interesting thing is that we all have biases, right? If we want it or not. And when it comes to serendipity, one of the key biases that I've been super fascinated by is really this kind of post-rationalization that we all do, which is essentially, you know, when you think about how you present your CV, let's say you do your next internship or you apply to your next job, you will probably tell them, well, I planned this and then I did this and I wanted to always go into this industry, so I did this. Yeah, but probably that wasn't how it happened, right? Probably it was more like you had a sense of direction somewhere and then you ran into someone who told you about something like another job or so, and then kind of like that unfolds. At least like in later stages of life, that's what happens a lot of times. And so we a lot of times brush serendipity out of our life by pretending that we have it all mapped out and then telling the story in a linear way, even though it happens more like a scribble that goes like this. And that's the same with strategies in companies, where of course, when I'm the CEO, I always want to say, I planned everything out before, but actually a lot of times part of it was actually emergent. And those of you who will, you know, study strategy or else, you will hear a lot about this kind of emergence strategy versus kind of the planning strategy and how we have to make sense out of both at the same time. But so there's all these biases such as post-rationalization or underestimating the unexpected, how often it happens. And we can do an experiment later on if we still have time around the birthday paradox. I'll just make a note that if we still have time, we could do that, which is really showing how often we, in a way, that the unexpected happens all the time, but most of the time we don't see it. And so we miss opportunity all the time. Now, what are some of the ways that we can, and by the way, maybe just on that point of seeing potential triggers or being able to you know, be alert in the world, I want to share one experiment with you that a colleague in the UK did. Essentially what he did was he took a person who self-identifies as very lucky, and that's also the question at the beginning. So I'm glad that most of you consider yourselves lucky, which means you will attract more serendipity in your lives. A colleague did an experiment where he took someone who self-identifies as very lucky. So someone who says, good things always happen to me, you know, life, like people will be okay and X, Y, Z. And someone who self-identifies as very unlucky. So someone who says, bad things always happen to me, I'm always in accidents and these kind of things. And he tells them, walk down the street, go into the coffee shop, order coffee and sit down, and then we'll have our interview later. That's done. Now, what he doesn't tell them is that there's hidden cameras across the street, that there's a £5 note in front of the door of the coffee shop. And then inside the coffee shop, there's only actors. And next to the counter, there's this extremely successful businessman who can make big ideas happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman. That's the kind of next seat that there is, has a conversation with the businessman. They exchange business cards and potential opportunity coming out of it. We don't know that. Now, the unlucky person goes down the street, steps over the £5 note, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, also sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, and that's that. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, so how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, well, it was amazing. I found money in the street. I made new friends, and we don't know about the opportunity, but obviously it wouldn't be unexpected. Now, the unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And that's obviously what we see a lot in life, where some people seem to be a little bit luckier, even if they have exactly the same situation happen than other people that are around them. And so it's really about one of the first steps being alert to the possibility of lucky incidences possibly happening all the time. One thing before diving into, or two things before diving into some of the practices is really one question around how can we actually identify serendipity? How do we distill it? A lot of times, of course, we identify it after the fact, right? So we, for example, some of our work is qualitative. So we look at what are the life stories and happenings of people, and then we try to trace back when were decision moments where they made certain decisions and how did they make them differently than others, for example. And so one way there is really to look at counterfactuals. So to look at what could have happened. You know, I told you about this example in the coffee shop, right? Depending on your decision, there's different trajectories. Some of you might have watched Sliding Doors, the movie, where, you know, depending on if the person catches or not catches the subway, life turns out to be very different. And that's obviously all the time in life, right? That there's counterfactuals that could have happened had we done something different. And so there's one experiment, for example, where a couple of decades ago, there were two researchers who at the same time injected rabbits with enzyme, with the enzyme papain. And they saw that the ears of the rabbits flopped. And so that was unexpected, right? That ears would flop. And only one of them actually, made the connection to saying, wow, like that probably has to do with bloodstream, and related after then to arthritis and kind of like a medication against arthritis, which became a super successful research stream. The other one didn't follow up on it. And so what we're seeing here is that this unexpected discovery of like an amazing new thing, for one worked out, for the other didn't, because they made different decisions over time on acting on it versus not acting on it. Now, as I mentioned, we really need to be aware that a lot of times there might be things that hold us back, both our individual biases, but also societal biases, societal constraints. And so we need to be obviously very aware working on this. Now, one of the pleasures, by the way, of working on this book, before diving into the practices, was to really kind of realize also my own biases, right? In terms of how I, for example, looked at success, like success in relationships, for example. I mean, I remember I went to, because success, obviously, if serendipity is about creating positive outcomes, there's the question of what makes a positive outcome and at which time do we look at it. And so, I remember when I came with the first edition to the publisher, the first manuscript, and I was like, hey, here's the manuscript. And they were like, oh, great, we like it, but we need more love stories. And I was like, well, like, I'm not sure if I, as the then kind of 35-year-old single guy, if I'm the right person to write about love. And they were like, no, but see if you can find some kind of love story somewhere. And I was like, okay, I'll try. And so right after that meeting with the publisher, I had a meeting set up with a good friend of mine who was also my ex-girlfriend. And so, we met for a coffee, and I asked her, so do you know of any love stories? Like, I need a love story. And she was like, well, our story. And I was like, what do you mean our story? Like, we're not together anymore. Where's the success there? Where's the positive outcome here? And she was like, well, look, like we met serendipitously in a coffee shop, watching each other's laptops when the other was on the toilet, and then getting into a conversation, and then kind of, hitting it off from there. And then it didn't work out, but we, were amazingly kind of emotionally supportive to each other. And also we put each other on different trajectories in terms of the people we met, and the people we met put us on the routes, on the tracks that we are on today. So in a way, it led to positive outcomes, even if we're not together anymore. And so it was really the idea of redefining also, when do we look at something like success? So do we look at it in the moment? In that moment, when you break up, it feels like bad luck, right? But in the long run, that bad luck might actually turn into good luck. So that's really about the incubation time of serendipity, but also the question of redefining what we mean as success in general. Anyway, so long story short, there's a couple of things we can do to cultivate serendipity in our life. And, that's obviously a whole book about how we do that, but I want to focus on a few here so that we also have enough time still for questions and the conversation. The first one is really about asking questions differently. We all know this dreaded "what do you do" question, right? At a conference or when we meet a new person, and that obviously puts us into a box, right? It directly kind of, oh yeah, like I'm a professor, or I'm a business consultant, or I'm this and this and this. And so there's this wonderful entrepreneur in London, Ollie Barrett. And if you would ask him, what do you do? He would set hooks. He would kind of create a couple of potential meaningful accidents. And he would say something like, well, I'm a technology entrepreneur, but recently started reading into the philosophy of science. But what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential dots that you could connect, where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. I recently started playing the piano. We're hosting a matinee, come by tomorrow. Or, oh my God, such a coincidence. My brother is a professor in the philosophy of science. You two should connect. Whatever it is, we can use every conversation to seed a couple of hooks, to seed a couple of things so that the other people can really relate to and coincidentally identify something that they could connect with. The same how we ask questions. Do we just ask something like, what do you do? Or do we ask something like, what's on your minds? What inspired you the most about this presentation? Or other things that are really opening up this opportunity space for potential dots to connect. Another way is to look at mistakes or crisis differently. We just talked about, up to 50% of inventions and innovations, such as Viagra, are quote unquote serendipitous, in the sense that there is some kind of accident happening, right? Like in the case of Viagra, but then they see something in that accident and do something with it. So that's also for all of us to realize that a lot of times when something doesn't go wrong, it doesn't go right, it doesn't have to be an imperfection. Actually, it might be a great catalyst for something great to come out of it. And so to really reframe away from mistakes and imperfection towards experimentation and things that can actually propel us forward. And one of the practices I really enjoy there is the project funeral. So the project funeral is the idea that usually in companies, in communities, or in our families, when something goes wrong, we try to not talk about it, we try to hide it. But that's actually what we really learn from, right? Those kind of things that don't work. And so in this case, the company, one of the companies, they developed this window frame, and the idea was the window glass, and the idea was the light wouldn't reflect. And so it's an amazing technology that doesn't let the light reflect, but they didn't realize that, you know, people wouldn't pay a lot of money for that kind of thing. And so what they did was they brought that to, they laid it to rest in front of project managers from other divisions. They said, look, we learned that next time we should focus a bit more on the market, and this is our learning. Now, someone in the audience goes, hey, have you considered what this would mean for solar? Have you considered how cool it would be if you take that technology into a solar device and the amount of energy that could absorb? How great is that? And so that is how part of their solar division emerged. It was completely coincidental that that person was in the audience, that there was the right time, right moment. But they essentially created a process that made it more likely that these kind of serendipitous things would happen. And so companies are increasingly using things like this, or even like small things, you know, in meetings, asking things like, what surprised you last week? Or what questioned your assumption, to get people into the idea of, hey, let's connect dots for where usually we wouldn't even look for dots to connect. Now, a third practice is around reframing situations. That's really a huge one in every context. One of the organizations I've been working with called Reconstructed Living Labs, they have essentially they developed a low-cost education methodology that they apply across sub-Saharan Africa. And they came out of the Cape Flats in Cape Town. Most of them were former drug users or like grew up in very heavy constrained environments. And they take that methodology, which is essentially 10 steps to learn about social media or 10 steps to build your business. And they take that into other local communities. And instead of going in and saying, what resources do you need? What our natural impulse is, they go in and say, what is already here? There's an old garage, fantastic. That's a potential training center. There's a former drug dealer, fantastic. That person will be resourceful. That person will be having amazing social capital. And if we can turn that person into a teacher, that will be having a lot of leverage towards other people. And so the core thing here is that they reframe situations away from resource constraints to the idea of how can we make the best out of what is here. And we can obviously do that in every context. If you're a bank, right, we applied that in banks, for example, that wanted to close down because, you know, you don't need cashiers anymore when you have an ATM. The idea then is, okay, if you have a cashier, that person or that teller, like the person who sits at the cashier desk, that person could be a potential financial trainer. And the old office space, instead of closing it down, could be a financial training center. And so really looking at resources differerly and making the best out of what is at hand kind of really gets us into the idea of how can we make the best out of what is here. There's a lot of other practices. I'm going to do two more, and then we can dive into the conversation and focus on what you find most interesting. I'm a big fan of serendipity bombs. So the idea of, you know, identifying the people who inspire us the most. And LinkedIn has this wonderful function, for example, where you can reach out to every second degree contact and send them a message. And then essentially identifying the people we admire the most and sending them a heartfelt message saying, you inspired me so much. I just wanted to put XYZ on the radar, whatever comes to mind. So not in a pitchy way, but more in a way that builds a genuine relationship. And when you do that with 10 or 15 people, 1 or 2 or 3 will go back and say, my God, such a coincidence. I've been working on a similar area to what you've been doing. We should connect at some point. And the point is that in a world where, you know, the next job will come from those kind of relationships, it will not, you know, some positions are written out, but like in a fast changing, uncertain world, a lot of positions are written out after the fact, right? So they find you and then they write out the position to say, okay, we need to somehow formalize this. But the point is that those are the kind of relationships, the more we can build them already when we're studying, already when we're kind of in a period where we're not necessarily searching, the more then later on there can be real beautiful serendipity emerge from it, related to jobs, but also more generally to friendship and other means. A big one at the moment, of course, is around the question of how can we leverage technology and space design. I mean, in the old days, we would do things like having mailboxes of people from different divisions in the same place, right? So that the project manager has to run into the creative, has to run into the developer when they pick up their mail, so that they have nudges to meet each other. Burning Man did that a lot, right? When they essentially have different tents in the desert. They have art in the middle, so that people have an excuse to talk with each other when they bump into each other looking at the art. So there's all these small nudges we can do in terms of space design. But of course, with COVID and kind of virtual worlds, we have to bring those moments virtual as well. So the traditional water cooler moments happen less. So there's all these different tactics here around random coffee trials, for example, where people, you give 1 hour per week where you say, I'm free then, and then the company matches you with people from the company who you don't know yet in a random way, so that you grab a coffee with them, you have an inspiring question you talk about. And so you recreate water cooler moments by this kind of randomly being matched up in companies, which also helps people come closer together. And last but not least, and that really comes back to the Goethe question. I mean, I'm a philosopher at heart, so I have to close with a philosophical note, but that's really related also to a very pragmatic point, which is that one of the things that came out of our studies, we've been doing a recent study with 43 CEOs of the big companies, everything MasterCard, Danone, who have been trying to become a bit more purpose-driven. And we sat down with them and tried to understand what is it that makes them really successful. And what they have in common is that they all are really good at saying, this is a certain North Star or a certain purpose or a sense of direction or a deeper curiosity that guides us. So there's an approximate sense of where we're going. But at the same time, we have a deep appreciation for the unexpected. So I will tell you our vision. I will tell you where we're going, but I count on you also to, if you see something in the strategy that unexpectedly changes because we have new information or data coming in, I need you to be part of recreating that. And so that's really about this kind of slight humility also of saying, we can't figure everything out, but we can still provide a sense of direction. And so that's where serendipity happens, because you can constantly react to the unexpected and connect it to that deeper North Star. And so the philosophical note here really is that, Goethe, who comes from Heidelberg, the city where I'm from, or he doesn't come from there, but he wrote some of his poems on the philosopher's way there. And he used to say that if you take someone as they are, you make them worse. But if you take someone as who they could be, you make them capable of becoming who they can be. And that is what serendipity is all about. Serendipity is all about potentiality. It's all about what could be, and how can we essentially develop, you as future leaders who will build companies, who will run companies, who will be in leadership positions. How can we form these kind of different platforms and vehicles for people to become their best selves and to enable them to have more serendipity, because we can't know exactly where the world is going. We can't know exactly where we will be going, but what we can do is we can build a muscle for the unexpected and then make the best out of where the world will guide us. With this, I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Also to flag, right, in the spirit of serendipity, please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, on Twitter. I'm Chris Serendip on Twitter. On LinkedIn, I'm there as well. Let's keep in touch, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. CEMS obviously is very close to my heart. I've been part of both kind of, as a student and then later as a teacher, very involved with it. So I'm delighted and excited to be here with you today. And thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Christian. I'm going to encourage the attendees to please type your questions into the Q&A box, because the nice thing about the Q&A box is you can upvote other people's questions. So we don't end up getting the same question repeated many times. You can see other people's questions. So please go ahead and do that. In the meantime, we did receive some questions in advance. So Christian, why don't we start with those? There's a question here. How do we keep ourselves at ease with uncertainty? Because we don't know what's going to happen and when.
Yeah, well, that's a great one, because that's, I come from Germany. When I grew up, it was instilled in me that we have to plan everything, that we have to, have every move panned out. And I think especially in business schools, of course, we get trained in this idea that we have to have exactly a strategy and exactly the next steps. And then life happens, right? And life kind of throws us off, because we're like, oh my God, like, why didn't anyone tell me that it is not like just a step-by-step process? And so one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the serendipity mindset is to say that, yes, we want to plan as much as we can in a sense of like where we want to go, where our passions are, and we want to figure that out. But at the same time, also, when we develop that idea that every conversation, every moment could lead us to something even more amazing, even more meaningful, then what it does is it reframes in our minds kind of the anxiety enhancing uncertainty, which is all about ambiguity and, oh my God, will my plan still work? To the idea of, you know what, if my plan doesn't work, the world won't go down, because maybe actually there's a better plan, and maybe I should be open to that better plan. And I can tell you, when I look at my life, so for example, the first company that I was part of setting up in a community called Sandbox Network, we built that during the financial crisis in like 2008. And, we had it first planned as a conference, and we had sponsors on board, and it was supposed to be this big conference where people for the first time would meet from around the world. And then, sponsors just jumped ship. They were like, hey, look, like marketing spending is not our priority anymore. Goodbye. And so it forced us to completely turn the model around and to say, maybe instead of making it a conference, let's make it a very hub-based kind of local community-driven model where we start with small local events and we let local people evolve and develop them. And so when I look back now, that is the reason why it became such a close-knit community, because people were first locally building these deep connections before then later meeting at a big conference after a couple of years when the sponsors were back. And so the point is, in that moment, it felt like, oh my God, the world is going down, the idea is done, we are all done. We felt our identity was threatened, right? Who am I if I'm not the founder of XYZ? And so it really felt like extremely threatening. But then that moment of saying, wow, maybe there's even more that we could do with this, that was extremely relieving. And I think that is really coming back to that idea of resilience and grit in terms of saying, how do we train ourselves to see everything that doesn't work and everything that is ambiguous as this kind of moment of saying, wow, maybe I can learn about myself here more. Maybe I can learn more about the world, and maybe I can do even more with this. And I think it's not easy. It's easier said than done, because, I still feel the anxiety that comes with ambiguity. And at the same time, I think having seen life play out and having seen the life of like the hundreds of people that, for example, for the book we talked with, like they all came out of these like moments of kind of complete ambiguity and discomfort. And then out of that moment, real creativity emerged. And, one thing actually, if you permit, I don't know, Constance, if you have similar experiences, but one thing that I've found fascinating is when you have students come in who write their, let's say, master thesis, right? A lot of you might write your master thesis soon. And a lot of times you can very early on in the conversation see who will like do an exceptionally brilliant thesis, because the okay person comes in and obviously everyone is amazing, but the okay person comes in and says, I know exactly what literature I will use. I know exactly what I want to do. Give me your proof and stamp of approval. And you're like, great, run with it, do it. And they will, deliver a kind of solid piece of work. The outstandingly creative person comes in and says, you know what? I read into this literature and this and this and this, but I wasn't sure if this can also relate to this. So I just don't feel like yet I'm really there, and da-da-da. And that ambiguity, that creative friction produces the real like originality. It's almost like a Hegelian process of you need the thesis and the antithesis in some way to get to this kind of synthesis that provides the real original insight. And so it's really that kind of allowing for that ambiguity and going through that ambiguity. It feels really bad in the moment, and you will probably all go through it because it seems like this is a room of wonderfully exceptional people. But then at the end, you will be, wow, even if it felt so discomfortable, that actually propelled it to be even more creative. And so I think that's actually, when you ask creatives, right, a lot of their brilliant work comes out of sense of discomfort for a while, which then produces the real kind of wonderful things. And so maybe also as a note to that, overcoming the anxiety of, oh my God, like, am I a failure because I haven't yet produced this amazing essay or thesis? But that is part of the process, right? Because that's literally the iteration that comes, and then it usually ends up pretty well.
Great, thank you. So we have several questions in the Q&A now. The first one is, can you please elaborate more on serendipity bombs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So serendipity bombs is really about the question of how do we plant as many mines or many bombs out there as possible that could go off at some point in time, even if we don't know when that will be. So for example, let's say you just started your master's and you have a bit of time in your hands and you're thinking about, okay, great, like I'll go on the job market in 2 years, but that's still very like far away. But what you can already do now is you can develop relationships with professors, with people on LinkedIn, with people around you, and essentially kind of just develop like meaningful relationships where you put your interests on their radar. And then in a couple of years, when you will be like, hey, I'm looking for XYZ, they will be like, my God, such a coincidence. I'm doing exactly this at the moment. We should connect. Or they might even think of you when you post something on LinkedIn and so on. So that's really about like seeding a lot of potential things already now that then later will probably go off once you're really looking for it. And I think that's in general one of the things I would think about when you think about your career, that a lot of people only look for opportunities once they are in that stage of, oh, like 3 months to like deadline or something. But like, if you think about how really interesting opportunities emerge, they are kind of coming because people trust you over time, and they're like, oh yeah, great, like this is the person I want to pull in for this and this project. So the thing there is really to connect with people early on, to seed a bit of what you're interested in, to develop these meaningful relationships, but then also to send a couple of cold emails to people. We talked earlier about like how you get endorsements for books, but everything else as well, right? It's literally, it's a numbers game, right? You reach out to as many people as you can. I mean, in my case, you know, I had to apply to, I think, 40 universities to get into an undergrad because I was just really bad in high school. And so the point being that it's a numbers game of how much you have to seed. And I'm still pretty sure that the only reason why the university where I ended up with took me was because there was something idiosyncratic in the application where I said something very personal around you know, my past and XYZ. And I'm sure maybe the person who selected the things was like, oh my God, yeah, my son is a similar trouble kid, like maybe I should do, you know what I mean? Like this, there might have been something in the application which serendipitously made them think the grades are really bad, but you know what, like this kid might have some kind of potential. And that's what happens a lot of times, right? That people coincidentally see some kind of overlap and say, okay, that fixes and that can do something. And so long story short, Serendipity Bombs is a lot about seeding as much as we can in as many areas as we can, and putting ourselves on the radar.
Great. And as you said, it's a numbers game. Okay, so here we have a question that 7 people have upvoted. Every now and then, opportunities are opening up for me, but how do I know exactly which one is worth pursuing? In hindsight, it might be easier to know which one might have been worth it, but it is extremely hard for me to know right in the moment. Maybe it's a generational thing and not being able to commit fully.
That's a great question. And it's actually something I've been struggling with as well. And I think especially in, you know, different periods, right? You might have periods like when you write a book, for example, where you don't want to have a lot of serendipity happen because you just got to be focused, right? Or when you write your thesis or so, like you just got to be focused. You don't want to have too many distractions. And one of the things there is, so I'm a big fan of both trying to figure out a certain North Star or deep curiosity or something that we're really interested in, because then you can also use that for every subject you're doing, right? You're trying to then relate that a little bit to that kind of core interest, passion, whatever it is. It emerges over time, of course, but it's really about an approximate North Star, which then makes it easier to connect something to it. So what I do, for example, or actually, I mean, that's what Paul Polman does, like the ex-CEO of Unilever. He was really good at saying, I have a North Star, which is I want to help people who can't help themselves. And I want to do that with Unilever. So if he serendipitously ran into someone who pitched to something, he would only accept coincidental things that would actually relate to this North Star, and everything else would be on the parking lot. And I do something similar where I'm like, okay, like great, like this could be fantastic, but let me put this on the parking lot because it doesn't fit into the North Star at the moment. And so the North Star, the curiosity, becomes a filter through which then to look at these kind of things. And it's not about throwing these things away, it's about parking them. And that's actually why I'm a big fan of a kind of serendipity journal, which is essentially saying, becoming a bit clearer about what is my curiosity, what am I interested in, what is my story of self. So if someone asks me, what do you do? What do I say? That really kind of seeds a little bit of the kind of interesting things that then could lead to something interesting. But also then thinking about how do I react to unexpected moments? And like, do I just, you know, like react in certain ways that lead me to destructive things? Or do I react in certain things where I give myself the space and the time to reflect on that? How do I do that? And really kind of journaling a little bit around what are these moments? What is the pattern? Does it help me? Doesn't it help me? And really kind of, it's a very idiosyncratic process. And I think journaling around this can be super helpful. And then third, it's really one thing I found super useful is to have a sounding board. So to have, in my case, my partner with whom I make sense out of things, and then kind of, you know, serendipity having an incubation time, to your point, where maybe I run unexpectedly into Constant, who tells me about a cool new book. And then I leave it at that. I think about it later. And then I'm like, oh my God, yes, Selina told me something earlier. I got to put them in touch, right? So that serendipity might only happen very much later. But my partner then would be like, yeah, but you know what? You first have to do X, Y, Z and then do that later. Or kind of helping me prioritize things and so on. And I think companies like Pixar have always done that with ideas, that they have brain trusts where informally you know, you say this idea is good at the moment, this idea doesn't, and just kind of put them on the parking lot. So I think the idea of filters being super important.
Yeah, and I think that is important. That addresses one of the other questions that asks, can't this serendipity mindset put too much pressure on an individual to accept every possible opportunity? Well, no, not if you have a filter, not if you have that North Star. Okay, here's another question that was upvoted by 3 people. Was there a situation in your professional life where you could openly state, I have no idea how it happened, and land an opportunity? Or did you have to perform a reverse rationalization still?
That's a fantastic question. And I think one of the reasons why I wrote that book and why I'm so excited about it is that I feel it gives us a more active language about these kind of things. Because previously I would also, right? Like if I don't know, let's say I you know, started Sandbox and I kind of go to an investor and the investor asks me about our strategy. Like you can't just say, we'll have it emerge, right? Because then they're like, well, you have no plan. I can't put money into what you're doing, right? And at that point, I didn't have a language for it. I didn't have a language where I could say, yes, hey, here's where we're going. This is the steps we have. And at the same time, we will be ready when a crisis hits because we have a muscle for the unexpected happening. And obviously I wouldn't say it in that way, but like it's this idea of like, I'm open for it. To give you an example, I was really fascinated by Governor Cuomo here in New York. So, you know, when COVID happened, the different states in the US acted very differently. A lot of the governors essentially were like, hey, like, we will close down now, but then we will open up exactly on May 15th. And this is the exact timeline. And so they committed to an exact strategy, an exact timeline. And now the problem with this is, of course, that when you do that, now when you have new information that's unexpected about a COVID outbreak or whatever it is, you have to revise your timeline because you obviously want to be realistic, or you have to hide the data, right? So both are negative outcomes. Versus Cuomo, what Cuomo did was he missed a little bit of the initial kind of outbreak, but then he was like, look, my 2 key principles, my North Stars are like economic health, so like whatever I can do for the economy, great, but also public health. So these 2 have to be fulfilled. And here's an approximate timeline. This is approximately when we will open up, but I'm already telling you now that if there is some kind of information coming in that tells us we can't open up, I will not open up, we will revise the timeline. And by openly stating that he would revise the timeline, if his principles wouldn't be met, he actually took real control, because all the others had this illusion of control where they thought they could portray control, which works for 2 weeks, right? But then after 2 weeks, when that information comes in, then they are the ones who actually get really vulnerable, because now they either have to hide or they have to do something. And so I've seen that in my own life as well, that I think this mixture between being kind of showing leadership by really kind of portraying, this is where it's going, this is the vision for it, this is what we want to do, but we also have the agility to react if something else happens, that actually portrays even more control, because it's just realistic about how the world works. And so I think there's a lot about this where for a long time, I think people got away with kind of half lies in terms of, oh yeah, we have this all figured out. But I think people don't buy that anymore, especially, you know, currently in a COVID context where like nobody has it all figured out. And I think what we've seen in our work with these kind of leading CEOs, for example, is that at the end of the day, they're really good at portraying this like sense of, we know where we're going, but also having the humility to say, we are ready for the unexpected, and we will build that into our strategy when and as it emerges. But it's a great question, because it's very counterintuitive, right, to how we think about leadership. And we think a leader has to map it all out and know it everything. But then the beautiful thing is, you know, after the 3rd glass of red wine, every leader will tell you that at points they're just winging it, and even if they're really good at pretending that they don't.
Okay, so we only have a few more minutes, but let's try to get through a couple more questions. This was upvoted by 4 people. Going a bit further on this question of uncertainty, I would like to know what you think of serendipity and Corona. Is anxiety and uncertainty of how the next day will look like in Corona times, and with regulations changing every day and who you're able to meet or not, influencing serendipity? People close themselves and serendipity is harder to get or to observe?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think COVID, I mean, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, I had it in March. It was like the worst 2 weeks of my life since a very long time. You know, to not be able to breathe, to like go through a really tough period. And I'm a big fan of, you know, kind of social distancing as much as you can, because again, even as a young person who's extremely healthy, it does have a lot of effects on you in the long run potentially as well. one of the things of like, it takes a lot of kind of potential serendipity away, right? It takes a lot of the kind of connectivity away that we traditionally have, right? In terms of like in the office or even like in the coffee shop and all these other places where we interact. And virtual interactions, of course, are always a bit more, not necessarily stiff, but they're a bit more formalized, right? A bit more, you have to be very targeted to say, I go into this meeting now, or I go to this conference. And so there, I'm really a big fan of trying to figure out how can I use small things, such as the way I talk with colleagues, or like all the things we talked about in terms of the strategies for serendipity, like taking that into our online life as well to make the best out of the situation, but also then to really think about like, how can I, to give an example, like use like a virtual Zoom conference to like ask questions that then can cultivate serendipity. So to give an example, something we did in the offline context, but what we've tried in the virtual context now as well is, I've been doing a lot of work with people from less privileged backgrounds. So people who have a very rough time, really bad CVs, or like CVs that just don't fly that much because someone maybe came out of prison, or things that really hold people back from having a career. And the deal there was go to public events, and of like something that's open, right? Like universities or Royal Society of Arts or something else. And then you are the one who asks the first question. And in these kind of Q&A sessions, for example, like you can obviously ask a question, and then if your question doesn't pop up first, you just ask another question, as long as then your question, I mean, not doing it too much, right? But like doing it in a way that your question pops up so that it gets selected, and framing the question, like what we've been working on with people is to say, one sentence is about, thank you so much for this inspiring speech. So making it all about the speaker. The second sentence is about, as someone who just went through XYZ, so like whatever we feel comfortable sharing, but it might be as someone who just kind of, whatever that we feel comfortable. And then I wanted to ask you for advice on this and this. So the point here is, what always happens then is that in the audience, a couple of people say, oh my God, like I went through a similar kind of period. And then they might text the person or get in touch like via other means, ideally even in the chat. I mean, we sometimes accelerate that in the chat ourselves, but it works better in offline events, of course, right? Where directly after the speech, someone can come to someone and say, oh my God, like such a coincidence, my brother just had XYZ period as well, or my sister went through this. But the point being, like using these kind of moments where you have visibility to really seed something and put something out there can be a great way to increase serendipity, being that via the Q&A things, being that via other ways. But I think to your point, like COVID definitely has taken a lot of this away, and we're still beginning to understand how can we replicate a lot of this online. And I think nobody has unfortunately found the absolute silver or golden bullet for that yet.
So Christian, can you just expand a bit more on practical tips? So this question is, what advice do you have for trying to share the concept of serendipity within your wider community, company, or organization, especially as a more junior member of staff? Is there anything that tends to work particularly well in getting people to buy in and change the way they approach things?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because one thing I've realized is that a lot of times it's really about small nudges. So it's less about the big picture and like trying to convince someone about the big picture, because they have to experience it themselves, right? So I've had colleagues, for example, who would tell me, hey, Christian, like this is all great, but I don't need serendipity in my life. I have a pretty good life, or something like that, right? And then like once you start telling them, hey, look, why don't you ask a question slightly differently next time you're in a meeting, or next time if you're leading a team meeting, why don't you ask a question such as, was there anything unexpected in the data last week, or whatever it is, like these kind of small things that you do, small nudges, small changes in behavior, where people then come after 2 weeks and they're like, oh my God, I didn't know life can be so joyful. I didn't know we can like, discover so much in the unexpected. I mean, there's studies, for example, that show how quickly companies can save money by asking slightly different questions about what surprised you last week, for example, because then essentially it incentivizes people to look out for the things they didn't expect, which can save a lot of costs, for example, when you're thinking about how a lot of times we go through with a plan or strategy because we don't want to see things that don't fit into that. But once we prime ourselves to actually seeing it, then it becomes an okay rhythm and people get more and more into it. And so it's really the way of how we then design meetings. If we bring in some of these questions, the way we ask questions towards them and get them into that modus, I've seen people literally just starting with like simple questions around, you know, what's your state of mind, or what inspired you about like XYZ last week, or just something that kind of opens it up a little bit. And the more people get into it by speaking about it more and more and seeing some of the effects, the more it usually kind of then takes over. So I would really start with some of these kind of like very simple like practices we talked about earlier, and kind of ease people into it, and then usually that has a kind of beautiful ripple effect that goes out.
Great. Thank you, Christian. So as usual, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but I think we've covered a good amount. Thank you so much, Christian. I think everyone found this really interesting, and I've seen some very positive comments in the chat. I think, Selena, we'll hand back over to you.
Yes, perfect. Well, thank you very much also from my side, Dr. Busch and Dr. Locke, for this really insightful webinar. I think it was a wonderful introduction of how all of us can kind of view our life from a slightly different perspective. So I'm sure a lot of people are also interested now in hearing more about the topic of serendipity through your book, Dr. Busch. So thank you very much for that. Maybe we can also gather the remaining and unanswered questions and maybe send them out after this webinar as well, so people have the chance to hear everything. But with this, yeah, we're kind of nearing the end of our webinar. We would like to thank all of the participants for joining our 13th episode of the CEMS Webinar Series. We really hope you enjoyed the topic of the serendipity mindset and can take away some very useful insights for your future. And on just a final note, we would love to hear your feedback. So right when closing this webinar, a link should automatically show up on your screen, and we would highly appreciate it if you would just have a couple of minutes to spare to fill out the feedback form. And we also look forward to welcoming you in one of our future webinars, either the one focused on diversity and inclusion during the Career Forum, or the next ones on finance and human resources. So thank you very much, Dr. Locke, Dr. Busch, and thank you also to our record number of participants for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Selena. And thanks so much, everyone. And thanks so much, Constant. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Christian. Always good to see you.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Selena, there is a question in the chat. Is it possible to get the PowerPoint?
Well, I might redirect that question to you, Dr. Busch, but I mean, we have a recording of the webinar, which will be uploaded to YouTube. So you can also check the slides through the recording. You also have the chance to kind of hear back the comments that were made. Yeah. So maybe that's an option.
Perfect. Great. Sounds great. Thanks so much, Selena.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.